Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined today once again by our good friend Theo Gremminger. Theo, I don't know how many times you've been on this show, but it's a bunch, and we always appreciate it, always enjoy talking to you. As usual, let's just start the show by you kind of telling everybody what you've got going on this time of year.
Yeah, so this time of year, I'm churning out content for both Player Profiler and for Fantasy Points, doing a ton with the rookies, doing a lot of Dynasty content, also some redraft content. Did an early 2025 redraft rankings. But yeah, Heath, just doing a ton of content, and very happy to be back here chopping it up with you. Always have a blast on your show.
Well, you said that 2025 rankings, and I think people think we're insane when we talk about that. But I've actually spent the first 2 days of this week starting to build out my 2025 way too early projections, which of course will kind of be the bones behind the rankings. I've gotten through the Chiefs and the Bills and the 49ers and the Ravens and the Colts and the Lions and the Bears. But, I enjoy that this week where I'm kind of just like, here's the beginning of the projections process. And I think the other thing you said, like talking about the rookies, that's what almost everybody in Dynasty is doing right now. And we are going to do a ton of that on this show over the next 3 to 4 months. But in light of those 2025 projections and rankings, we got to remember, like, we do play this game to win championships. And a lot of times it's the old guys that help you get over the top. So we will be talking vets today on FFT Dynasty. Derrick Henry, Cooper Kupp, is he going to be traded? George Kittle, and much more. We always start with 3 questions for our guest. I always stretch the definition of a question because I'm just going to make a statement. Theo, let's hear your Super Bowl prediction.
I think it's Philadelphia's year. I think it's Philadelphia. And if you're a gambler, I think it's Philadelphia in the over. But I think what Philadelphia has been able to do since the last 2 times these teams met in the Super Bowl, they've been able to get much younger and much better on the defensive side of the ball. Tons of talent in the front 7, and obviously adding Saquon Barkley and Kellen Moore as offensive coordinator. I think this team is really good. Also, you have a back-to-back champion who's only a 1-point favorite. I understand that Kansas City had this massive win over Buffalo, a very hard-fought game that could have gone both ways. And I think people think of them sort of as like, this team cannot be beaten. But Philadelphia has the makeup to do it. I think they're a very talented team, and I think they get it done, Heath.
So obviously, you look behind me, and even you look behind Theo, I think you see Patrick Mahomes on his wall back there. And everybody knows there's no questions about who I'm going to be cheering for in the Super Bowl. But I will say, like, if the Chiefs are not going to win the Super Bowl, the Eagles might be the team that I think is the most deserving. Like, I'd be so happy for Saquon Barkley. I've been higher than everybody else on Jalen Hurts since before he was in the NFL. I'd love to see Jalen Hurts be the guy, not Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson, that knocks off Patrick Mahomes. Maybe get Hurts a little bit more respect. I'd love to see A.J. Brown, Nick Sirianni, like that defense with Vic Fangio. I think they would be a deserving champion. Am I going to cheer for that? Of course not. Am I going to predict that? I would not. But if Philadelphia somehow slays the dragon, then yeah, that's fine. They've earned it. Now, Saquon Barkley didn't quite make today's show because we're talking about older guys. But 28 used to be really old for a running back, and he's going to turn 28 during the Super Bowl. How do you feel about Saquon Barkley's dynasty window? Is it still best viewed as a win in 2025 with nothing guaranteed beyond that?
I think that that's sort of the pragmatic way to approach older running backs. But with Saquon, I think that there's a secondary path where people might be selling just to sell, and it kind of bites them in a Derrick Henry-like way. He's a next level athlete. Mm-hmm. He's multifaceted, and he's also sort of extended his window by playing with this very strong offensive line and playing next to a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts. So for me, if anybody's going to age gracefully that's not Derrick Henry, well past their 30s, like to the 31-year-old range, it could be Saquon Barkley. But yeah, sure. If you want to be rostering these older running backs can get you in trouble. But I do think with Saquon, it's one where you have to be really careful before you cash out just to cash out. because he could be the league winner again next year.
So last year was kind of the year of the older running back saying, like, not so fast. Don't write us off yet. Almost all of them either delivered or exceeded expectations. But Christian McCaffrey was 28 going into last year, I believe, and he'll be 29 this year. He was the guy last year that we were saying he's just been so elite. We're going to ignore this aging curve. We're going to ignore any injury risk. And then like multiple injuries that crop up. How are you viewing Christian McCaffrey if you're a true contender?
So I think if you're a true contender and you're rostering Christian McCaffrey, I think you just sit on the asset you have. I don't think this is a player that selling now would be the correct move. I think if you want to get out of Christian McCaffrey, wait until we get to training camp and Christian McCaffrey is fully healthy. People in San Francisco said that if San Francisco would have made the playoffs, McCaffrey would have been good to play. This is a guy where everybody in San Francisco says he's back to being fully healthy right now. So it's not one where we're going to have to go through an entire offseason wondering what his return date will be. I think that the market might be sort of over punishing McCaffrey on the redraft side, Heath, where you're starting to see McCaffrey as like a late second round pick in early underdog ADP. I think that that's sort of a dynasty community will be way, way ahead of that one, where people are already sort of like saying this is a guy we want to trim off of our rosters. I do think that with McCaffrey, unless you think that San Francisco is going to make a play for Ashton Genty, and they're certainly in a position to do so, to make a slight move up or just stand pat and take him, then I think McCaffrey is going to get through the offseason and actually gain a little bit of dynasty value, because when fully healthy, this is a guy who's been beyond excellent. There's been no change in terms of the offensive scheme. Shanahan knows how to maximize Christian McCaffrey, and his competition in the backfield is going to be Jordan Mason and Isaac Arendo, two backs that we don't dislike, but certainly not real threats to take away work from McCaffrey on a game in, game out basis. So for me, I think that if you're looking for an assassin and someone in your league wants to get rid of an older back and they're willing to take Christian McCaffrey for 80 cents on the dollar, it's a calculated risk if you're a contender. But I think you could end up with a guy who's 16, 17, maybe 18 points per game next year. And with his pass catching ability, he should have some longevity as long as he can stay healthy, sort of like we saw this season with Alvin Kamara.
We've already got a question in the chat. In fact, a trade, probably wants a grade, just traded Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, and Cortland Sutton for Chuba and Tyreek and Dynasty. And I will tell you that I believe Kupp, Deebo, and Tyreek all on the rundown later today. So just for first thoughts, Theo, when you look at Kupp, Deebo, and Sutton for Chuba and Tyreek.
I think I prefer the Chuba and Tyreek side if I'm going into next season as a contender, because I think Chuba Hubbard showed this year that he's going to be a high-end RB2 at the very least, if not an RB1 if Carolina takes that step forward next year offensively, which they could with Dave Canales. Jonathan Brooks is going to miss the season, and Chuba Hubbard, they've extended with a contract. I think he's an underrated dynasty asset to have right now. And with Tyreek Hill, that's a difficult one to gauge. But when it comes down to Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, and Tyreek Hill next year, who's going to score the most points of those three? I think it's still Tyreek Hill if I had to bet on one of those three guys. So it comes down to Cortland Sutton coming off of this massive season where there was little to no target competition in Denver. We think Denver is going to remedy that this offseason, whether in the draft, trade, free agent. Denver's got to get some weapons. So for me, I think I'm leaning into the Chuba and Tyreek side and consolidating my roster.
That's exactly what I would say. It's pretty similar on my trade chart in terms of total value. But anytime you're giving up 3 and getting 2 and the trade chart says it's even, that means you're winning the deal. Tyreek is the best player in the deal. Also like that as well. If you have more questions for us, put them in the chat now. Again, I know some of you are watching on YouTube. Some of you are watching on Twitter. If you want to make a comment, if you want to ask a question, you got to come over to YouTube, put it in the YouTube chat. We will answer some of the chat questions at the end of the show. Let's take our first break, and then we'll get into the vets.
The clock never stops. Relive the greatest moments with uninterrupted highlights and more.
It's Gareth Bale! Ronaldo! Wonderful goal!
now on the UEFA Champions League channel. Streaming free.
So I basically got 3 categories, and I'm certain somebody's going to say, you forgot this guy. So if I forgot somebody that you're really interested in their dynasty value, that'd be a great use of the YouTube chat, and we will talk about those guys at the end of the show. But the 3 categories are old, yet still elite, is the bottom about to fall out, and they're washed, right? And so with this first category, old and still elite, I kind of want to talk about all these guys because they really still were fantasy difference makers. It's easier once you start to see the decline in a player to really worry about that age. It's harder when it's somebody like Derrick Henry, who somehow at 31 years old has his most efficient year in half a decade. Derrick Henry, by all rights, should not still be doing what he's doing, whether it was because he had too many touches in a given year, whether he has too many cumulative touches, whether he's too old to play running back, whether he doesn't catch passes. But Theo, he just keeps doing it. Do you view him as a safe RB1 for next year, and you just forget about the age and make him show some decline before we care?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if there's a downward path, he's still going to have a high level of value as the goal line back in the Baltimore offense. So for me, I almost think that it would be foolish to bet on him not being an RB1 next year. I think he'll be a solid second round pick in redraft. I think the redraft community is going to bet on him once again, despite his age. And the production he had in year 1, we talked about Saquon, but it was also Derrick Henry's first year in Baltimore. That sort of landing a next to Lamar Jackson in that offense extended his dynasty shelf life. And the numbers were insane. It was one of his best seasons ever as a professional in terms of several metrics, almost all of the efficiency metrics. And we truly believe in the Todd Monken system at this point.
Right.
Todd Monken, I think if he was a little bit younger, would have been hired very quickly by another team this offseason as their head coach. He happens to just be a little bit older than NFL teams like to see. But I think one more year of this sort of production, I think a team will hire Todd Monken as their head coach. And people can say look at all the talent he has, but he's been able to adjust with missing multiple players in multiple weeks. So for me, Derrick Henry's in a perfect situation. He's a next level athlete. No one in football, well, I can't say no one, but there are a few players in football who do as much for themselves in the offseason as Derrick Henry. It's been well documented, from the nutrition down to the training regimen, down to the sheer amount of money he spends on goods and services. This is sort of a next level guy. And I think that he's somebody you just leave on your dynasty roster forever, unless you're looking to rebuild. This is a guy, what's the point of moving him? You're never going to get as much as he's worth on the field. And this could be another year where he's going to get you 15 touchdowns. Unbelievable first season in Baltimore.
4 years ago, I traded Derrick Henry away because I was starting a rebuild. He was going to be going into his age 28 season. I didn't know if I'd be any good by the time he was still good again. Traded him away for a first and a second. Looked like a terrible trade. Last offseason, I traded a second round pick and got Derrick Henry back, a very early second, and won a championship with him. I'm just going to hold him at this point. No, but I think it's interesting. This next guy, Alvin Kamara, is 2 years younger than Derrick Henry, was only 0.8 of a point worse in full PPR last year than Henry was. 2 years ago, Kamara was 2 points per game better than Derrick Henry was. But while I heard a lot this year about how wrong I was about Derrick Henry, everybody was taking Kamara 2.5 rounds later than Henry, and Kamara was almost as good. Should these guys just be really especially in a full PPR league, just right in the same range in terms of dynasty value?
So for me, I would have Kamara behind, the Derrick Henry tier. When we saw Kamara this year, the 44-point game early on in the season, and then he had a 27-point game. But we did see the splits when Kendre Miller came back and Darren Rizzi was the head coach. Kamara didn't get as great of usage as we saw early in the year. So for me, I think Kamara is an excellent player. who should be treated a little bit slightly less valuable asset than a guy like Henry based on a few things. I think that the competition for touches next year is going to be increased. There's been some saying that New Orleans could draft Genty at 9 overall. Uh, that's just sort of been rumored. It's going to be one of the best offensive players in the draft, if not the best one, and he should be available in New Orleans picks. Just as sort of a changing of the guard situation, New Orleans embraces Genty, builds their team around him. You could sort of see that. And even if they don't draft Genty, with a new coach coming in and new players coming in, I think Kamara, this might be the last year in New Orleans. I realize they extended him, but I just don't quite trust him to give me RB1 production next year, Heath. But I do think if you go into next year saying this is a very, very good RB2 for me, I think that's the way to treat Kamara, not as a high-end RB1.
The way they deal with his contract, I think he pretty much has to stay in New Orleans, and then they're going to be paying him for 3 years after he's actually gone because they just keep pushing future money out further and further. I would ask you just rank these three because we've talked about them. I mean, Saquon Barkley's quite a ways ahead of all these guys for me in terms of dynasty rankings. But when you're talking about Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry in a full PPR dynasty league, how would you rank them?
Wow, that's a really difficult question. I think the way that I would approach it is, if I'm a contender, I'm going to take on Derrick Henry because I think he's the safest bet next year for me to get a potential 20-point per game season. Then I would actually pivot from Kamara. I would go with McCaffrey at 3 or behind Henry essentially at 2, because I do think that the peak season, if we're going by a ceiling approach, a ceiling season for Christian McCaffrey next year in a San Francisco offense is going to look better than Alvin Kamara in what should be a highly new offense in New Orleans with a new head coach and potentially a new approach, potentially a new quarterback. So I love having Kamara, but I think I take the chance that Christian McCaffrey gives us one more CMC-like season.
I had 2 wide receivers on the old and elite category, Mike Evans and Davante Adams. And both of these guys had hiccups. We saw early in the year, Adams not quite looking like himself in Las Vegas, had some struggles when he first got to New York. But then late in the season, Davante Adams is just once again an elite wide receiver, finishes the year as a top 12 wide receiver on a per game basis once again. Mike Evans had the hamstring injury, comes back, and we talked about it the whole time he was out. He's going to need this many yards per game to hit 1,000 again. He's going to be a league winner. He came back, he hit the mark. He was a league winner. But again, while these guys finished the year as top 12 wide receivers on a per game basis, it wasn't without any warts at all. Do you think that Evans and Adams remain elite? And is Adams more context dependent than Evans at this point?
I'm not so sure about the context with Adams' argument, where I've heard that one, Heath, where some people are saying, we had the hyper-focused targets because he got reunited with Rodgers, etc. He also had a great deal of success last year in Vegas and the year before in Vegas. This has been a player that has put up massive spike weeks. We saw a 43-point week in week 15, and he gave us a 20-point week in week 16. So this is a guy that was scoring towards the end of the season. Davante Adams, you're also getting at a discount right now if you want to roll the dice. Potential change for him. He's 32 years old. There's going to be a lot of people looking to get out of Davante Adams. But if I need a one-year guy, Heath, there's few players that have better trade value at cost potential than Davante Adams. He's been at the top of his game still and played well down the stretch. And I think that the team situation is just so beat up and there's so many question marks that you actually get him. Evans, I love. And Evans is a guy where we talked about him last year when we podcasted together as a potential trade target. I do worry about one thing with Evans is I think that people are sort of all projecting Chris Godwin to be on a new team next year. But I think we could see Godwin back in Tampa Bay. They hired Josh Grizzard as the offensive coordinator. He was actually their third down play caller last year, and they elevated him. So Grizzard was number 1 in the NFL in terms of third down efficiency. Baker Mayfield had a great deal of success with Chris Godwin earlier this year in the Liam Cohen offense. and Jalen McMillan came on a little bit. So for me, I think Mike Evans is a very good asset to have, but I do think that there is going to be potentially more target competition for him next year in Tampa Bay. And that's not even including what they're going to do with Bucky Irving next year in a full-on situation where he has a year under his belt. Maybe he takes a big step forward as a receiver, sort of like Devon Achane did this year. So I think Evans is fine, but right now I can get Davante Adams for cheaper than Mike Evans. And I think they're both sort of at their age, you're betting on another year, sort of an assassin pickup where I'm going to get 1 year of production out of the guy. That's at least the way we should be treating these older assets. So I would take the discount on Davante Adams right now rather than paying up for Mike Evans coming off of this record-breaking year.
So we agreed before the break, Tyreek Hill over Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill over Cooper Kupp. How would you rank Davante Adams, Tyreek Hill, and Mike Evans?
I think you still should probably take Tyreek Hill ahead of those two. Tyreek Hill is the youngest of the three. He's had the biggest peak season of the three recently. His year in 2023, if he didn't get hurt, it would have been a wide receiver 1 overall season. And even with getting a little bit banged up at the end, he still was neck and neck with CeeDee Lamb. Hill had one of the best seasons we've seen in the last 5-6 years as a wide receiver. This year, sort of everything went wrong. And then we found out that he actually was playing injured all year long, actually got injured during the traffic stop on game 1. It was just a very weird season, from missing Tua Tagovailoa to the traffic stop. I mean, everything was sort of weird. Then you get the Tyreek Hill could be traded this offseason rumor. I don't know. I think this year could be a mulligan. I don't think this is the last. I don't think 2023 was the last very good Tyreek Hill season we've seen. I think he'll bounce back next year. And we do have a little bit more clarity with him than we do Davante Adams. And I just, you got to go Tyreek over Mike Evans, Heath. It's just process.
I just love putting you in these difficult decisions, letting you do the ranking, and then I just move on to the next question. The next question, the last elite vet, George Kittle, who, we had a lot of debate, at least on Fantasy Football Today, about Sam Laporta versus Travis Kelce. I said Trey McBride, others said Mark Andrews, and the answer was George Kittle or Brock Bowers. Kittle with another exceptionally productive season.
Yeah, I mean, George.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say, the thing that once again though I hear was, but somebody was hurt. He needs somebody to be hurt to be elite. Is that just nonsense?
I think it's a little bit nonsense based on the sort of the longevity that George Kittle has had. This has been a guy who's continually put up top 3 tight end numbers in terms of points per game. This year actually leads the position with 15.8 points per game. Kittle's another one of these sort of timeless guys where we keep waiting for it to fall out from under him, and then he has 1,000 receiving yards. So for me, Kittle is a weapon of mass destruction with spike week ability that can really win us a week. And at the tight end position, that's few and far between. I think Kittle also, when we talk about 31, tight ends age gracefully. We've seen it with several of these elite tight ends. George Kittle is truly on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy football tight ends, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for it. He's happened to play in the same era with guys like Rob Gronkowski, guys like Travis Kelce, but Kittle, with the longevity he's had, with the success he's had with Shanahan, the success he's had with Brock Purdy, and the fact that we think San Francisco is going to be a potentially better offense next year, Heath. They were missing Trent Williams for a good portion of the year, missing Christian McCaffrey for a good portion of the year. We saw Juwan Jennings come on as a player. We saw Ricky Pearsall come on as a player. They're going to get Brandon Ayuk back. Kittle just sort of settles into his own. I do think that you have to, when the 49ers are fully loaded, you have to kind of put up with spike weeks with Kittle, where it could be a little bit annoying one week, followed up by a spike week. I think that's sort of the difference in his scoring next year versus some of the younger guys who are clearly the number one target on their team, like the Bowers, McBride. But if you're betting on somebody for tight end 3 next year, Kittle's very much in the mix. And for us as dynasty managers, I mean, this guy's showed no signs of slowing down athletically. So I'm fine having George Kittle on my dynasty rosters. I'm not looking to sort of pivot down to a younger asset because I know what I'm going to get with Kittle, a guy who's going to be 15 points per game and provide me a potential game-winning score when it matters most.
I will say that going through the 49ers projection and trying to keep the total team target share below 100 is no fun at all. Because like if you just look at what happened last year, it's hard to not project Juwan Jennings to lead this team in targets, especially when we don't think Brandon Ayuk's going to be 100% to start the year. But then you look at the year before, or you look at the year, like there's too many options. And generally speaking, and this has happened in San Francisco before, you just understand that one of those four guys is going to get hurt. Maybe two of those four guys are going to get hurt, and the other guys are probably going to be awesome. So you should just draft them all higher than what they're projected to do with everyone there. And for dynasty purposes, I think you just pursue the cheaper guys. We're going to move on to the second category, and Michael has a question. I'm catching up, but what would you sell Aaron Jones for? Sorry if you've already covered him. We haven't, because he is in section 2, is the bottom about to fall out. I had two running backs here, James Conner and Aaron Jones. Conner got hurt towards the end of the year. We saw Jones' efficiency struggle a little bit at the end of the year. These guys both at the age to where before last year, we would have been saying, yes, they're obviously too old. Conner is obviously going to lose touches to the young guy. Minnesota's probably going to draft somebody. But as I talked about, we just saw the year of the old running back. So when it comes to James Conner and Aaron Jones, I guess first you can answer Michael's question, like what would you sell him for? And which of these guys are you more worried about the bottom dropping out?
You know, it's funny. I would have thought that Aaron Jones would have been the one that I would have bet on over Conner heading into next year. But Conner has contract stability where Arizona is going to bring him back, and they used him in a very high volume role. Aaron Jones was very good this year for Minnesota, better than I thought he would have been there. But he is going to be a free agent. This is a player who's 30 years old. So I do think that there's a chance that Aaron Jones is on a different team next year. So I would lean to Conner in the head-to-head. For me, Aaron Jones is sort of, you could throw him in a group of running backs, Heath, where they might have more value right now than they will after the NFL draft. I know we're not supposed to talk about the 2025 rookie class this show, but this is an exceptionally deep class. And I think a lot of these guys sort of in the non-premium asset running back class, the Jones, the Tony Pollards, these guys, if somebody wants to pay you for them, it's not the worst pivot because there's going to be a number of players that you're going to want to draft this year on your roster. I mean, there's like 10 running backs in this draft class, Heath, that I think after the NFL draft, we're going to really want on our dynasty roster with potential for more than that. So if somebody wants to pay me a second round pick for a 30-year-old running back who is sort of up in the air, I'm willing to listen to it. But on the flip side, if I'm a contender, Jones is a decent bet to make. I think a lot of this, whether he's a buy or sell, falls into team context. If I'm a surefire contender, I think at the very least, Aaron Jones is a committee back next year based on the juice he still showed in Minnesota.
So I think second round pick was exactly what I was thinking that I think you'd take if you want to move off of Aaron Jones right now, especially if you can get one that's in the first half of round 2. That'd be fantastic. I was wondering, I had a couple of names of guys who were drafted last year, and I'm wondering, like, let's say you're wanting to get a little bit younger. Would you take a Trey Benson or a Braylon Allen for an Aaron Jones?
I would. That's a tough one. I think that you can create a pathway in your head where a year ago we really liked Trey Benson. James Conner is going to be the oldest starting running back in the NFL next year, one of the 2 or 3 oldest starting running backs in the NFL next year. And James Conner is a guy who's missed a considerable amount of time in his career, except for this magical 2024 season when no running back got hurt. James Conner has been a guy who's continually gotten hurt. So I'm taking shots on Trey Benson. I don't think that's the worst pivot, but I do think with Trey Benson, the fact that Amari DiMercato got more work than we both would have anticipated. I know when you were doing your projections this time last year, you weren't projecting a lot from DiMercato.
No.
So I think that's a little bit of a indictment on Benson, that it took him a little while to earn touches away from DiMercato. But I would potentially make that pivot. I think Benson has the juice. Now, Braylon Allen's an interesting one because that's a player that I think we should be trying to trade for. He has the contingent upside if Breece Hall is to miss time. And I think that there's a non-zero chance Breece Hall's traded this offseason. He's been mentioned by some as a rumored trade target where New York could look to make a splash, could look to trade him away before they'd have to pay him. Hall's a terrific player for us in fantasy football, a great pass-catching back, but he's never had 1,000 rushing yards. This is a new coaching staff in New York, and I think that there's a chance, not necessarily a great one, that having Braylon Allen and Breece Hall on your dynasty roster could turn into a blackjack split where they both are starting running backs next year.
Love that. I had 3 quarterbacks on the bottom about to fall out, and some of you may think bottom already did fall out for Russell Wilson. We're thinking super flex, and after he took over as the starter for Pittsburgh, he was a pretty good QB too in terms of a super flex starter. Russell Wilson, Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, who it sounds like is probably coming back for at least one more year. How concerned are you about the bottom falling out for these QB2s in super flex leagues?
Well, I'll give you some props, Heath. I always have to go back to an old episode we did, but when Russell Wilson was at his like dynasty bottom, where he was unattached, people thought he was done. Is he going to retire? You were telling people to make a small trade offer and pick him up on your team. And if you would have listened to Heath, you would have gotten several very strong starts this year. Was a good super flex asset. That being said, I think Russell Wilson is sort of in the same boat as he was last offseason, where a team's going to look at him as a potential bridge quarterback for a younger one they draft, or I couldn't improve the quarterback position, so I'm just going to go with Russ for a year. I think he's got a chance for that. The issue is we can't look at him in the same context because last year he was on that super team-friendly deal where Pittsburgh wasn't paying him hardly anything. This year, Russell Wilson's going to want more money, which could potentially box out a couple of teams. I think if he's willing to take the same amount of money as last year, then the market's going to be wide open. But if it's hey, I played well enough this year, I need to deserve to be paid. I'm only 36. I'm not 40. I think that it could be a smaller market. This could be the quarterback of the Las Vegas Raiders next year, though. I think that the familiarity he has with Pete Carroll, apparently they get along very well now. They've sort of mended any sort of fences from the past. And that sort of makes sense to go with a bridge quarterback if Vegas doesn't get access to or doesn't think that this 2025 quarterback class is worth investing in. I think Russell Wilson could be the bridge quarterback for them this year. So I don't know. I think that this is one where it's worth a gamble, but don't pay anything worthwhile. You're looking to buy Russell Wilson shares for cheap.
My expectation is that one of the Steelers quarterbacks from last year is going to be the Steelers quarterback in 2025. And whichever one it is, Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, the other one is going to be the quarterback of the Raiders. I do kind of think I want to see Justin Fields in a Chip Kelly offense. That sounds like a lot of fun. So we focused mostly there on Russ, and he is the one whose floor is about ready to fall out. I think everybody knows the deal with Stafford. It's just going to be an annual game of will he retire or not. And one of these years, the answer is going to be yes. And you can't really do anything to predict that, but you're not getting anything for him in trade anyway, so that's okay. Geno Smith, though, has seen his value fluctuate a lot over the last, 2 seasons. And going into this year, we were pretty excited about a new offensive coordinator that was going to really unlock Geno Smith again. Now we're talking about a new offensive coordinator that's going to really unlock Geno Smith again. Do you think that there is some risk that people, get tired of the Charlie Brown with the football with Geno Smith this year and his value plummets?
Well, I think with Geno Smith, the value has already gone down a little bit in Dynasty. But I do think that for Superflex, the guy has value to us. And I think that the Clint Kubiak offense could be beneficial for him. We saw the early numbers from Derek Carr look very strong when they were at full health and they had Rashid Shaheed and it was a fully healthy New Orleans team. With Geno, I think if we just are realistic about our expectations for next year, treat him somewhere between like QB 15 and QB 18 in terms of our points per game projections. We can't keep chasing the top 6 season that Geno Smith put up a couple of years back. But the devil's advocate to that is Kubiak seems like a coordinator who knows what he's doing. JSN came on this year as a receiver. I think one of the issues in the change over to Kubiak was there was a little bit more wanted out of DK Metcalf. So I think that they'll lean back into DK Metcalf on some high value looks. And the two running backs are both very, very good players. So Seattle is going to be a team that's going to be in a contending position for a playoff berth, which sort of boxes the Seahawks out next year from getting one of the elite 2026 quarterbacks. So Geno might have a 2-year window in Seattle. Now, if they lose, he's done. They'll make a change. But I think Geno was good enough this year, and Seattle's bullish enough about him that it'll be another year for him in Seattle. I know there's some saying Seattle could be in the mix for like a Jackson Dart. I don't really see that. I think it's going to be Geno for another year. So you have at least 1 year and potentially 2 if Geno has a winning season. So I think he's just a be realistic with what you have type asset rather than a guy who's going to completely fall apart.
And then we have 3 pass catchers here. I actually had 4 because I had Tyreek Hill, but we've talked enough about him. And I think that we've heard that Theo's pretty optimistic about at least a little bit of a bounce back from Tyreek Hill. But Cooper Kupp is telling everyone that he's going to be traded, assuming that the Rams want to eat enough salary so Cooper Kupp can be traded. Keenan Allen is going to be a free agent and was just doing everything he could to stand in the way of the Rome Odunze breakout last year. Did a very good job of it. Travis Kelce may win another Super Bowl and ride off into the sunset with Taylor Swift. But to hear him speak this week, it sounds like he hopes he's still playing football 3 years from now and winning Super Bowl. So when you look at these 3 guys, I think it's really easy to see how the floor could fall out. Cooper Kupp can't find a team that really wants him and ends up in a pretty bad situation. Keenan Allen, everybody just says, no, you're too old. Travis Kelce decides to retire. Which of these guys are you most worried about? And are we maybe sleeping a little bit on Keenan Allen because he didn't show any signs of decline this year?
You know, I think you sort of nailed it with the Keenan Allen one. When Chicago made the switch to Thomas Brown, we saw Keenan Allen sort of have several weeks where the amount of targets were insane. So we've seen back-to-back seasons where Keenan Allen has had these incredible target games. This is a player that multiple quarterbacks have wanted to target at an incredibly high volume. So I think that there is a chance that Keenan Allen is going to sign with someone, will like the landing spot, and he's going to be a productive wide receiver 2 next year. I think Keenan Allen has some outs, and he's dirt cheap. Last offseason, he was dirt cheap when he went to Chicago. He's even cheaper heading into free agency. So I think if you want to take a chance and you're a contender and get a guy that you can potentially put in your flex, put in your wide receiver 3 spot next year, Allen might have a little bit of short-term value. Now, Cooper Kupp can't stay healthy. Like Cooper Kupp, the guy was 14 points per game this year. The guy was 24% target share. Had a couple of really good games at the beginning of the season. It's just a health thing with Kupp. He's apparently extremely motivated, but he was extremely motivated last season. Last offseason, we saw the Cooper Kupp offseason workout videos. The guy looked so in shape, looked incredibly quick. But you see this with these older football players. Guy plays 9 games. Guy plays 14 games. Guy plays 13 games. And it's sort of like a few years in a row where the guy continues to miss time. It doesn't usually result in like another year where he plays every single game. So know what you're getting in Cooper Kupp. I do think there'll be a market for him. I think there'll be a few teams. I know the Washington Commanders have been rumored. There's been a few other teams, sort of the Houston Texans, a number of teams where they might want to take a chance on Kupp. And apparently he's very highly motivated to go to a new team and perform well. I just worry about him staying on the field. He's 31 years old, but he's missed a ton of time recently.
I just wonder about the connection between Cooper Kupp and Duvall. Liam Cohen, like there's a little bit of a relationship history there. I think Kupp would fit pretty well next to a Brian Thomas Jr. He doesn't have to go be the number 1. And maybe then we could actually get excited about Trevor Lawrence. We're going to take our second break. We are going to answer some more of your questions after the break, but I do need to read this comment from Joey Wright. Heath and Theo sounds like a buddy cop movie where one of them is a dog trapped in a human body. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, Joey, but we love you anyway. We'll be right back after this break. So I'm going to presume that Joey was talking about like the names Heath and Theo, like it's the name of a movie, and not that our discussions sound like one of us is a dog trapped in a human's body. I've got one section left, Theo, and this section is they're washed, right? You can take that however you think I mean it, but I'm just going to go through and we'll choose which ones to talk about. But for now, just one word answers. I'll give you the name, yes or no. They're washed, right? Aaron Rodgers.
Washed.
Nick Chubb.
Washed.
Raheem Mostert.
Washed.
Stephon Diggs.
Maybe not washed. Maybe he has a year left in him.
DeAndre Hopkins.
D-Hops is washed.
Adam Thielen.
Not washed. Underrated. And when he's attached to Bryce Young, he continually performs well. If he's in the wide receiver 2 spot next year in Carolina, he'll be underrated once again.
Tyler Lockett.
Las Vegas bailout, maybe, but probably washed.
So we're pretty much on the same page on all of these. I think people might want to give Nick Chubb a little bit more grace and a little bit of an extension because of the injury he was coming off, and maybe he can bounce back, but I don't want to bet on running backs his age bouncing back. So I agree with you completely on that one. I think of all the guys on here that should be washed, it's Adam Thielen because he's the oldest guy on here, but he's shown no signs in terms of his production. Now, I think he's got some options. Is he a free agent going into this year as well? Like he has to choose whether he's coming back, or Carolina has to choose whether they want to bring him back?
I believe Carolina can bring him back. I believe it was like a team option, but don't quote me on that one. Still diving into the free agent class. But for me, it's like Thielen gave us that 28-point week in week 17. And before that, he had a 15-point week, a 20-point week, a 24-point week. So as soon as he came back from injury, it was Adam Thielen once again. And we saw the same thing in 2023. Bryce Young targets Adam Thielen. This has been his guy. And Adam Thielen has shown really no signs of like slowing down. It's a really, really cheap bet to make. But if you're drafting in early best balls right now, go draft yourself some Adam Thielen. And if you want to float like a 4th round pick at some manager in your league, they're going to say, sure, you can have Adam Thielen. He's too old for my roster. And you might have a guy that can give you 10 starts next year at an absolutely zero cost.
Looks like he is on the team for next year. He has a cap number of $8 million, about half of which is guaranteed. So yeah, I hope Adam Thielen is there and in that same role. I agree that like performance-wise, he's not shown much. The problem I have with Diggs is almost the same problem I have with Nick Chubb. I'm not sure that Stephon Diggs is washed. I'm also not sure that we're going to see the best version of Stephon Diggs after recovering from that injury next year. And it's easier with younger wide receivers to say, yeah, but in 2026, he'll be back to himself. In 2026, Stephon Diggs might be out of the league. So like I do have some concerns there, but I wouldn't want to give up on him at this point either. Let's get to a couple of questions from the chat before we get out of here. We have a question. I have Achan, Christian McCaffrey, and Alvin Kamara. Do I try to move one of the older backs for a younger back or for draft picks? Or if you had these 3 running backs, Theo, are you just thinking, you know what, I'm going to go try to win the league?
I think I'm just going to go try to win the league because I would basically treat it as Devon Achan as my RB1. And between Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey, I'm going to get 17 starts combined. And I'm going to get low-end RB1 production if they're both healthy. I think your roster is built to win. No reason to pivot out.
Joe says, I see Marvin Harrison, Roma Dunze, Caleb Williams, and Trey Benson as buy low options I am jumping on. Where do you see their trade value in an out with the old break? So I don't think, except you're going to get any of those guys for any of the guys we've talked about, except for maybe Trey Benson. Is that right? Like I can't see in a 1 QB league, you might be able to turn one of these old stars into Caleb Williams because it's a 1 quarterback league. But none of the like Roma Dunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. are well above anybody we've talked about today, right?
Fantasy managers these days are way too smart to trade a Marvin Harrison Jr. or a Roma Dunze for cheap based on expectations that were not met as a rookie. The Ben Johnson hire has made Roma Dunze and Fuego in early underdog drafts, and his dynasty stock is still right there. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is a blue chip asset. people are going to give him a very long leash. And I think next year we'll see a Marvin Harrison Jr. Bounce back. I think there's got to be some self-scouting this offseason, Heath. But I think Marvin Harrison Jr., if he was in this draft class, he'd still be probably the wide receiver one. As much as I like Tet McMillan, Harrison Jr. would still be a guy, if you were redrafting today, you take him ahead of Tet. So I don't think you're getting those for cheap. Benson's an interesting one, and I do agree with you. There's enough disappointment going around with Trey Benson that there's a lot of fantasy managers that are just willing to re-roll their pick and say, hey, I took Trey Benson with the 203 in my Superflex league. Give me the 301, give me the 212, and we're good. I got him for a 212 in a single QB league, and I thought that was great value to pay. So Benson just needs a James Conner injury, and we're going to have this incredibly athletic back with explosive ability out in a solid offense.
So I've got a couple of names here because they're not old enough to have been talked about by us yet. They're still in their prime. But let's say you're heading into a rebuild or you're really wanting to get younger. Could you see trading an A.J. Brown for a Marvin Harrison Jr. or Rome Odunze? A.J. Brown entering his age 28 season next year.
Well, it's interesting because we don't necessarily talk about A.J. Brown as an older player, but if we look at the top 20 wide receivers on like Keep Trade Cut, he's the oldest one.
Not by 2 years. That's
2 years.
Like I'm looking at my rankings right now, and in my top 24 wide receivers, he is the only one who will be even 27 next year, and he'll be 28. So yes, 100% right. He is older than the field when it comes to these young guys.
It's an absolutely reasonable pivot to trade A.J. Brown for one of these guys plus, and I think that you can get Marvin Harrison Jr. plus from some dynasty managers, which is a trade that would have gotten laughed off a year ago. A.J. Brown also, when you play alongside Saquon Barkley in Philadelphia, it is now a Saquon Barkley offense. So I love A.J. Brown, but trading him this offseason is not the worst idea. He's no longer the alpha dog on the offense. He certainly is in the passing game, but the offense now has Saquon Barkley, and like you said, 28 years old. It feels uncomfortable to make trades like this, but sometimes in Dynasty, these are the trades that put you in good position for the next several years.
And I think you're right. Like, you got to get more than Rome Odunze if you're giving up A.J. Brown. I'm okay with A.J. Brown for Harrison pretty much straight up.
Yeah.
But if I was targeting Rome Odunze, there's another guy who's actually a year older than A.J. Brown coming off of a career year. And we talked about this a lot last week on the regular FFT show, Terry McLaurin. If you look at what he did last year, targets, catches, yards look very much like what Terry McLaurin has done. He went from a guy who was catching a touchdown on 4% of his targets to a guy who was catching a touchdown on 12% of his targets. Terry McLaurin will be 29 next year. That's the type of guy that I'd be wanting to trade for a Rome Odunze.
Yeah, I think that McLaurin has been a player that has been continually underrated in Dynasty because we saw as soon as he got a quarterback, he took off big time. I will say the one devil's advocate with McLaurin is I do think the target competition next year will be increased in Washington, and we can't bet on him to set the franchise record for touchdown catches again. So I love McLaurin, but I would be a little bit careful trading a lot for him. The back half of the year, the scoring was insane. He had several 20-point games, but he did give you that Week 11 game where he had 2 points. Week 17, he had 1.5 points. So we did see what the floor looks like as well. But, man, you're certainly rooting for Terry McLaurin to have another wide receiver one season, and athletically shows no signs of slowing down. Jaden Daniels is, I guess, good for staying younger at the wide receiver spot.
Awesome stuff. As always, Theo, as we close up here, just tell everybody once again where they can find your work.
You can find my podcast over at Player Profiler and Fantasy Points. I put out a number of Senior Bowl stuff recently over at Player Profiler. Fantasy Points, I have the update to my 2020 top 2025 for 2025 coming out soon. I think we're going to expand that to a top 50, and I'm dropping a ton of rookie content over on both channels. School of Scott over on Fantasy Points. I'm doing that with Scott Barrett every single week, and you can find Dynasty Life, press coverage, Sonic Truth over at Player Profiler. I'm a lot of places right now, Heath.
I absolutely love it, as you should be. Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you to everybody who was active in the chat. We have another show coming up on Friday this week. We will be having a kind of a Super Bowl spectacular. We're going to rank the Chiefs and Eagles and Dynasty and talk about their Dynasty futures. We will talk to you on Friday.